Angmar was one of Sauron's most successful creations of the Third Age. Ruled by the Witch King, Angmar succeeded in destroying Arnor and laying waste to the northern lands of Rhudaur, leaving them mostly depopulated even 1,000 years later. This naturally begs the question, what power did the Witch King have at his disposal to be so successful? In this video, let's ask the question, how powerful was Angmar? As is tradition, I have to start this video with a disclaimer. If you're expecting me to give you exact numbers for things like Angmar's army size, then I have an unfortunate answer for you. Tolkien never gives us the answer, therefore I cannot give it to you either. All we can do is make educated guesses based on things like the size of Angmar, the description of the land and its peoples, and the hints and clues we receive in the historical events that Angmar was involved in. Okay, firstly, here's a map of Angmar. As you can see, most of Angmar can be found west of the Misty Mountains. Although we don't know the exact borders, the heartland of the realm was located between the Etten Moors in the south, the mountains of Angmar in the north, and extending west to the mountains around Carn Dûm. While we don't know if Angmar extended north of the Misty Mountains into Forodwaith, we do know that the realm actually extended east of the mountains, in the upper vales of Anduin around the rivers Langwell and Greylin. So while Angmar was much smaller in size than the united Arnor, it was more comparable in size to the individual successor states of Arthedain, Cardolan and Rhudaur. But what's land without people? Unfortunately, we don't know a huge amount about Angmar's people. We know that its armies consisted of men. These were evil people of mysterious origin who had possibly lived in Angmar since the First or Second Age, and had possibly warred with the Arnorians before the Witch King arrived in the north. The other half of Angmar's armies were orcs, drawn from the mountains of Angmar, the northern Misty Mountains, and possibly also from Gundabad. Later on, Angmar's armies would also be supported by the hillmen of Rhudaur, who were possibly related to the men of Angmar. Now that we have the who and the where, let's talk about how powerful Angmar might have been. When we think of the forces of darkness in Middle-earth, we usually think of massive hordes that heavily outnumbered the forces of good. Both Morgoth and Sauron could throw away entire armies, and it sometimes wouldn't even dent their total forces. So it's natural to assume that Angmar might have been the same, and that Arnor fell because it did not have the strength to keep out the Witch King's endless armies. But in reality, the evidence suggests that Angmar wasn't supremely powerful, and that success against Arnor wasn't necessarily due to Angmar's strength, but rather due to Arnor's weakness. Firstly, Angmar doesn't seem like the type of place that could support a huge population. While we don't really receive a description of Angmar itself, it is described as cold, and Angmar means iron home, which doesn't really paint a picture of a green, fertile land. It's surrounded by mountains and hills, and has no large rivers. Furthermore, it was one of the only places in Rhudaur that wasn't colonized by the Númenóreans. The hostile locals were probably part of that reason, but evidently the Númenóreans didn't feel like it was worth it, possibly because the land itself wasn't exactly inviting. The lands east of the Misty Mountains were seemingly much nicer. We know this because only a few years after Angmar's destruction, the Aethiod, the ancestors of the Rohirrim, came north and drove out the remaining men of Angmar who dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin. However, despite these lands being fertile, they weren't exactly large, and in the case of the Aethiod, 500 years later, they are described as being constrained by their new land due to overpopulation. At this time, they could raise an army of 7,000 riders to aid Gondor in the south, and ended up being rewarded with the much larger lands of Rohan. This might suggest that Angmar, at the height of its power, might have been able to raise a similar amount of soldiers from their lands on the eastern side of the mountains. The other land that Angmar drew strength from was Rhudaur. Although Rhudaur was a separate kingdom for a while, it was occupied and absorbed by Angmar in 1409. While Rhudaur was undoubtedly more fertile and warmer than Angmar, it also isn't described as an overly inviting place, being mostly made up of dark, forested hills. It received the least amount of Númenórean colonization, which is why the Dúnedain were later overthrown by their hillmen's subjects. But given the fact that the hillmen were subjugated in the first place, they could not have been that powerful and were only able to throw off the shackles when the Dúnedain had been sufficiently weakened by civil war, and when the hillmen had secured an alliance with Angmar. While the lack of large, fertile lands might affect men, it has less of an effect on orcs, who were used to living and multiplying in terrible conditions such as volcanic wastelands, frozen wastelands, and barren mountains. In the case of the orcs who lived in the misty mountains around Angmar, they are described as increasing in number and attacking the dwarves more frequently around the year 1300, which was when Angmar was founded. But I do want to point out that while the Misty Mountains were constantly dangerous due to the presence of orcs, these orcs never actually numbered a huge amount, never really evolving beyond a regional threat, and their fortunes changed regularly throughout the Third Age. Basically, the picture I'm painting is that while Angmar could draw upon men and orcs from a number of different locations, it seems that none of these locations supported large populations individually. Together, these places could rally an army that was a major threat to the individual successor kingdoms of Arnor, but it seems that Angmar didn't really have a bottomless pool of manpower like Mordor or Angband did, and historical events seem to support this idea. For example, Angmar has some major success in their invasion of Arnor in 1409. They destroy Weathertop, killing King Arvalek I in the process. They decisively defeat the forces of Cardolan, killing the last prince and reducing the kingdom to a rump state. Their forces are even in sight of Fornost and the North Downs when they're finally turned back, thanks to the bravery of King Arathor of Arthedain and the arrival of elven reinforcements from Lindon. But the latter part of 1409 is far less successful for Angmar. The elves of Lindon rally together with the elves of Rivendell who had been besieged. Then, Elrond summons elves from Lothlorien, and together the elven army marches into Angmar. Although they are unsuccessful in destroying Angmar, they do so much damage that the kingdom is subdued for many years. While it's probable that minor conflicts continued, the next known major battle between Angmar and Arnor doesn't take place until 1851, 442 years later. Evidently, the events of 1409 sapped Angmar's manpower so much that it took centuries to recover. Another example is in 1975. Angmar had conquered Fornost and Arthedain, the last remaining kingdom of Arnor, had been overrun. Gondor sent an army north to help, a fraction of Gondor's power, but a greater army than the men of Arnor could dream of. At the Battle of Fornost, Angmar's army was being driven back even before Gondor's cavalry flanked them from the north. While we can assume Angmar probably suffered some heavy losses overrunning Arthedain in the first place, it's quite clear that their full strength at this point was still far less than what Gondor could put forward, and Gondor itself was only 30 years removed from a devastating war of their own. All of this suggests that Angmar wasn't hugely powerful. They didn't have endless numbers like Morgoth had in Angband or Sauron had in Mordor. They were a match for Arnor, a declining realm that split into three and was weakened by civil war, but were no match for Gondor, which was well past its peak at the time. Honestly, this probably makes Angmar's conquest of Arnor more impressive. The Witch King did have to be careful because he didn't have endless hordes that could be thrown into the grinder. So just how powerful was Angmar then? Like I said, we don't have numbers, but if I had to guess, Angmar's combined forces, say in 1409 or 1974, might have been equivalent to one of Sauron's major individual armies from the War of the Ring. I'd say that Angmar was far stronger than Isengard. Saruman seems to have only been able to put together perhaps 15 or 1,000 so soldiers during the War of the Ring, but I doubt Angmar's armies were any stronger than, say, the Morgul host which attacked Minas Tirith. The exact size of the Morgul host is unknown, but it was probably no smaller than 50,000, and probably no larger than 80,000. I'd say that's a decent enough range for the size of Angmar's armies. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I apologize if you wanted the exact numbers, but I want to be careful when it comes to the line of where Tolkien's statements end and where my ideas begin. So much of this video is speculation, but I at least always try to speculate based on the facts that we do know. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Angmar is scary, but Gangbangmar is far worse.